Hello and thanks for joining us from our studios in Israel. I'm Aaron Porras here with ILTV's Morning Briefing. In response to claims that Israel had crossed the Lebanese border to install spy equipment, several dozen Lebanese protesters gathered at the border last night. Some of the crowd even crossed into Israeli territory just outside of the border fence before being dispersed by IDF troops using tear gas and smoke grenades. The spying allegations against Israel were recently charged by Hezbollah terror leader Hassan Nasrallah, who just last week threatened not to hold back behind any red lines, saying in a conflict with Israel, the targets would include an ammonia tank in Haifa and Israel's nuclear facility in Dimona. Hezbollah and Israel were last engaged in a major war in 2006, and the border hasn't been completely quiet since. United Nations peacekeepers have kept some form of a watch, though Israel reportedly regularly conducts missions across the border. Just last week, Israeli jets were reportedly spotted striking a weapons convoy headed for Hezbollah. The IDF, as per normal, refused to comment. The first official Israeli mission to Australia by a sitting prime minister has ended today, and possibly with enormous implications on the two-state solution. A source close to the prime minister reported that during Netanyahu's meeting with Australian Foreign Minister Julie Bishop this morning, the premier allegedly stated he would never relinquish security control over a Palestinian state, and that his reasons lie with the international community's failure to protect Israel in the past from her neighbors. Netanyahu's statement was supposedly in response to Bishop's inquiry into what Netanyahu meant by supporting a Palestinian state. Over the course of Netanyahu's 5-day trip to Australia, he also met with Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, opposition leader Bill Shorten, and several other Australian leaders. Several leaders, like Bishop and opposition MP Bill Shorten, raised questions on Israel's settlement policy, support for a two-state solution, Iran, and more. Despite the questioning and the occasional protest, Netanyahu still described his diplomatic visit as wonderful. On Thursday, there was yet another defeat for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign as the Spanish town of Petrer voted to rescind its support for the movement. After facing a lawsuit by ACOM, a pro-Israel lobby group, the city of 95,000 became one of only 3 Spanish municipalities to voluntarily retract its support for the BDS movement. In recent months, Spanish courts have blocked 10 BDS resolutions and have suspended another 3. While promoting BDS is illegal in France, Spain has at least 50 municipalities that have joined the movement, the highest number out of any other country in Europe. We all have that one friend who loves to take selfies, but one young Israeli, Shivel Dickstein, seemed to be taking selfies to a whole new level. On Friday, Dickstein was arrested for trespassing when he tried to climb the Brooklyn Bridge so he could take a picture with the New York skyline. His arrest comes just days after a group of teenagers nearly drowned trying to take a selfie in Central Park when the frozen pond they were standing on cracked. Though this obnoxious trend seems harmless, selfie deaths have actually been increasing worldwide. The first reported one was in January, when a teenager was killed trying to take a selfie on a train track in Kashmir, India. For the first time ever, a public English library is set to open in the Gaza Strip. The only catch is that it happens to be in the library of a Palestinian graduate student. Mossab Abu Toha completed his graduate degree in English literature at the Islamic University of Gaza, and now teaches Shakespeare at a United Nations high school in the Strip. He's been quoted as saying, quote, "I have read dozens of books in English, and with them I can travel to every country in the world and through all periods. I feel like I'm in another world," end quote. Since Hamas's bloody takeover of the Gaza Strip in 2007, Israel has maintained a blockade, making it hard to import commercial goods, including books. To get around the blockade, Mossab has been asking people on Facebook to donate to the library. So far, he's collected more than 200 books, as well as over $2,000 from American and European donors.
Spicer also said that if there is any evidence of contacts with Russia, then the Justice Department should investigate, and he denied that a probe was being discouraged.
So, Margaret, it seems pretty unusual that a news organization would be excluded from a White House press briefing.
Well, this was an off-camera gaggle, and 4 of the 5 main TV networks, with the exception of CNN, and many print reporters, with the exception of the New York Times, very notably, the 2 networks, or the 2 news organizations, I should say, who reported this story very aggressively in the past few days and came under fire from the White House, they were not included in the briefings. Now, you'd have to ask the White House on the exact reasons as to why they were turned away at the door, but CBS was pulled today, which meant it was our obligation to record and feed out the audio of that briefing, and so that has been distributed by CBS to all of the news organizations.
Can you tell people, there's a White House Correspondents Association that helps deal with this. How are they handling the situation?
Well, I know the head of the White House Correspondents Association, Jeff Mason of Reuters, his organization was in the room for this gaggle today. He has raised objections on behalf of the entire White House press corps as to how this was done, asking for some explanation as to who was chosen and who was not. Now, to be clear, in the past, there have been briefings where select reporters, either print reporters or select TV reporters, have been included and inviting. This is not specific to this White House. However, what is unusual about this is that it comes at a time when the 2 main news organizations who are vocally saying they were deliberately turned away, the New York Times and CNN, were the ones who originally reported the story that the White House is pushing back so hard on. So that raises some questions as to the motivation for turning them away.
Interesting point there. I do want to ask you, Margaret, to go back to the conversation between White House Chief of Staff Reince Priebus and FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe. Do we know who contacted who about the New York Times story?
Well, what we know, according to White House officials here who briefed off camera, asking to be reported as White House officials, that is at their request, not have their names associated. What happened was Reince Priebus, the chief of staff, was meeting with the deputy director of the FBI. Following that meeting, this was at 7:30 in the morning, around February 14th or 15th, and was told afterwards that the deputy director of the FBI wanted to speak to him about another matter. And according to these White House officials, that issue raised was specifically the New York Times article about these reports of constant contact between the Trump campaign and Russian intelligence officials. Now, CBS News has not reported that story as such. What we have reported is that there was contact between Trump aides and Russians, some officials. So it's a nuance there, but it was actually reported in a way that certainly the White House believes was unfair to them. And the issue that was uncovered overnight was the fact that the FBI deputy director told the White House chief of staff that the story was inaccurate. The White House in turn said, please refute this publicly then, instead of just telling me privately, and the FBI declined to do that. The FBI is also declining to comment on the record right now about this story. So we are fully reliant on the White House's own account of exactly what happened. And as you heard in the story, Sean Spicer hit back pretty hard, saying, well, it's only natural for us to say, please refute this publicly. But there's some question as to whether that's White House interference in investigation or if that's White House pressure on public information. And of course, we heard from the White House, the spokesman, that he claims there's no investigation that he knows of underway.
Okay, lots of different pieces to that puzzle
Yes.
there. I do want to ask, is the White House allowed to discuss possible investigations with intelligence agencies? And if not, would there be any repercussions for their conversation here?
There are firewalls here, particularly FBI officials are well aware of them. And it has been a practice of White Houses in the past, when they're communicating about issues, to say we don't want to interfere in an ongoing investigation and therefore decline to comment publicly on it. What the White House is saying is, on this matter, why they felt it was okay to discuss it and why they felt it's okay to go public with their account is that they say this was specific to the story that was published in the New York Times, not an investigation. So they're drawing a distinction there, saying that they are in the clear in terms of communicating about this. But as we know from our own CBS News reporting, from our Jeff Pegues and his team, there are multiple probes into contact between Russian officials, Russians, and Trump aides, and that's not including the contact between the recently dismissed, I should say, National Security Advisor Michael Flynn and his conversations with the Russian ambassador.
I see. The president issued a new executive order Friday on regulatory reform. He says it directs each federal agency to form a task force to research regulations that are unnecessary and harm job creation. How is this being received?
Well, I was in the room in the Oval Office when the president signed that. He was surrounded by many very influential CEOs, the CEO of Dow Chemical and other big companies, and they all were applauding this decision to ask for a review because they are also being included in the decision making, or at least the information gathering process, and making recommendations to the White House on what they believe is a regulation that inhibits investment in the United States, that it's easier for a company to go invest in a country that has fewer, say, environmental regulations or fewer financial regulations than it is to keep jobs here. So this is another one of the type of executive orders the president has signed recently where it's ordering a review. It's not actually ordering a specific action. It's a consideration of future action, essentially. But the president has made clear that he believes regulation is an inhibition to investment in the United States, and he says he wants to make it easier to be able to keep jobs and money here.
Finally, Margaret, we were supposed to hear about this new travel ban executive order this week. It looks like it's now going to be next week. We also know that the president's going to address a joint session of Congress on Tuesday. What are you hearing from the administration about these two different things happening?
Well, we are hearing that 7 country-specific travel ban, the White House doesn't like calling it that, but this restriction on travel into the U.S. from those 7 Muslim-majority countries will be revisited next week. We're told the order itself has already been drafted and finalized, but the implementation and the rollout, the logistics of this, in essence, the White House says are still being delayed until next week. In the courts, there are still arguments going on, and this would help in some way, from my understanding, bypass that by trying to implement what the president's intent was here without having to take this to a higher court like the Supreme Court.